Both Julian and to Rory for providing those additional sort of comments and insights beyond what Don did. Now, we've got about 40 minutes, so pretty much half of the time left to be able to enter a discussion. And I think if I read my chair's notes right at ODI, the whole idea is to try to get some ideas from you who've come along here rather than just have a ping-pong question and answer session here. I really want to encourage a number of you here who I'm sure bring all sorts of different levels of personal experience or insight to share some of your thoughts. Trying to get sort of 4 or 5 different thoughts onto the table. I might bring it back, depending on how much time we've got, for a run up and down the speakers here who may want to comment a little bit on each other's presentations as well, and then get some more thoughts on the table. I mean, just while you're thinking about it, and then there'll be microphones to pass around in a minute. Let me just note that I think the framework that Don laid out, in particular, is an important one perhaps for us to use. Conveniently, he gave us sort of 6 drivers of potential success. The security dimension, I mean, again, that can be cut in various ways, and I think the Julian pointed out some of the difficulties of maintaining an effective engagement with local security forces, as did Rory as well, but building up security, human security within the region. The political framework, rule of law, legitimacy, the question of how, which we haven't spent much time talking about at all, the economic dimension, getting the economy going in its various facets, avoiding youth unemployment, etc. Again, something else we haven't dealt with as much, dealing with the past, the justice and reconciliation, but again, people here may have some comments about how central they do or don't see that issue. The rebuilding civil society, and I think, again, Rory made some very interesting points here about whether you're contracting out here, whether this is part of a sort of transactional approach, or whether it's part of capacity building for the longer term, and in fact part of reconciliation. And then something that the regional context, which, as Don pointed, has its pluses and its minuses. It's a double-edged sword, can be a positive dimension, certainly a sine qua non, but where regional actors can actually be, and especially neighbours, be obstacles. This whole idea that, in essence, the military, if the military is the lead player, the military that's going in first, you end up inevitably, and I think of this, the military is looking for action, for win, for lose, for solutions. A lot of what we're talking about here is process. And if you don't have a sort of process domination, but you have a results dominance, we may not get to where we want to go, or at least we'll be disappointed in our expectations. And more broadly, what are people's experiences here? Can some of you share some of the, I think, the optimism I gathered in the bit that Don wasn't able to talk about in his presentation, which was I think he said a rising set of best practices. I'll even use that phrase, Roy, you didn't want to, but best practices amongst certain institutions. He said, we have been learning lessons. We're not starting from ground zero here. Does anyone here have any insights as to whether that's the case or not? So it's over to you. To come in, don't be shy, please put a comment in, and I'll try and catch your eyes and so on. Let us know who you are, who you work for, and the microphone's on your way. I'm going to start with you, Sarah. I've got 2 other hands up here. First, oh yeah, you're going to take these mics away. I'll come back.
Thank you very much, Sarah Collinson with the Humanitarian Policy Group here at ODI. Thank you for 3 excellent and fascinating presentations. And I suppose my question relates to all 3, and in a sense it is about the ambition of the comprehensive approach as a policy agenda, and where we're heading, particularly if you go out of the context of Afghanistan, for example, and look at context in Africa. Because I think that how we see it from our perspective within the humanitarian sector, that there is a huge international exercise of, in a sense, firefighting going on. But there are a lot of infernos in lots of different parts of the world, and perhaps a handful of handheld fire extinguishers pointing in different directions. And perhaps the comprehensive approach has some traction as a label in terms of what the international community are trying to do in a context like Afghanistan, which is strategically so important and high on the international agenda. But perhaps the less ambitious sounding agenda of coherence is one that might apply more in the African context. But I suppose it's not exactly a question, but a comment. Is the ambition of this agenda way ahead of what is really achievable, particularly in contexts that are much lower on the international strategic agenda than Afghanistan. And what are the implications of that for different actors? I mean, in our specific area of interest, humanitarian actors, it has massive implications for how we can operate, how humanitarian actors can operate on the ground and what conditions they're operating under. And just as that's my comment, my question, as it were, for the panel. Just as a point of clarification, the background note that our speakers referred to is something that I sent them. I have written a blog which is kind of drawn from that, but I think we will put a link to that note so that if people are interested to see it, they can do so. And it draws on some work that we're doing within the Humanitarian Policy Group on stabilisation, which will be leading to a report in the next month or so. So, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That's great. If we take the microphone down, gentleman here first, then I'm going to you, Sarah, afterwards.
Thank you ever so much. My name is Hassan Ibrahim. I'm from Somalia. I'm totally astonished at the presentation that you gave us, and it was very, very useful, especially to us in our country. As you well know, Somalia has been a failed state for almost 20 years. And there is lack interest of the media and international community. Just they are approaching some other places. They are knocking different, doors. Otherwise, like Liberia, Afghanistan, or some other places. Somalia, since the war began in 1990, the child who was born in 1990, if he was 5 years today, just he's a man 25 years, and he hasn't seen any government, no education, nothing at all. So all they know is fighting and anarchy and the problem. International community has attempted once, but that was the conflict when it was brand new, and it has failed, and the international community, they withdrew. After that, just there was a blackout. There was never attempt happened again. Almost 15 reconciliation conference has been happened, and now there is an international recognized government in place, which is very fragile, and they control only the presidential palace and nothing else. What happened, for example, in this week, today there was a suicide bomber happened in Mogadishu, where the airport, the place that the government held, has been, there was suicide bomb with the base of the African Union base. I don't know the fatalities, but it's very serious that is ahead. And this week, Americans just, they achieved one of their best wanted man they targeted inside Somalia. They tracked, and then, So what I wanted to know is just the humanitarian crisis is deepening and just is worsening. Food shortage, medical shortage, children malnutrition, violent increasing day after day. And the relief agency there is a no-enter area at the moment. What I wanted to know is just you guys, what mechanism that you've learned in Afghanistan or Liberia or Democratic Republic of Congo can be approached in Somalia, and how can we bring attention to the international community to see this problem? Because day after day the people are dying. If they do not die by bullet, they're dying by hunger or by malnourishment, something like that. Thanks ever so much.
No, thanks very much for that point. We take the microphone, the gentleman in the back. Let me just say, I think this is a vital point. You pointed out, what lessons can be learned from Afghanistan, from Liberia. Of course, we look at Afghanistan, we're wondering, are there any lessons in Afghanistan at the same time? But the point here being how distinct and different each of these countries are. And therefore, what is a comprehensive approach, the big bucket, as Julian called it before, in that kind of context? And something I hope I can bring back to all three, maybe the panelists, maybe to Don. Is it an issue, given how different countries are, 25 years of conflict, no political system to reach into to recreate? Is it a question of sequencing? Is it a question of emphasizing different aspects of the menu that each of you have given us? Let's think on those thoughts and come back to them when we come back to the panel. So.
My name is Martin Barber. I'm a retired UN official. And Don, I was delighted to hear you say that elections are divisive. So why do we keep on holding them? Is basically my point. And would you agree that if elections are divisive, the most divisive and destabilizing form of election is a universal suffrage executive presidency election, which is what we've just held in Afghanistan. And if that is the most divisive and most destabilizing thing that we could have done to the country, why did we do it? And now that Paul Collier, in his book, Wars, Guns and Votes, has laid out extremely clearly what this type of election does to fragile states, is it not, I hesitate to say negligent, but is it not actually negligent of the international community to promote this kind of electoral process in a country like Afghanistan, or indeed in a country like the Democratic Republic of Congo, and expect to get positive results out of it? Because all the evidence available to us, and actually it's been available for quite some time, Roland Paris, over 10 years ago, laid it all out very clearly. Why do we still go on with this kind of thing?
That's a very important and interesting comment. I think one will definitely get some responses. It's interesting that we were saying this before we started. We're on a DDD agenda: development, diplomacy, defence, democracy. Well, whichever order. I wanted to make sure I could get the 3 Ds right. I'm very happy I got all 3 of them. But democracy not being in there, I'm just saying in that sense. And yet, as you point out, with elections being put at the heart, I wonder how much of this has linked into domestic legitimacy back at home. If those people aren't seen to be doing this, why are we sacrificing our lives, kind of thing? So that might be an angle. Let's see, we had one more question right at the back there, one more comment. And do pick up on the comments you've heard before, and maybe I'll get 2 more in, and then, yeah.
Thanks. Andrew Rathmell now with Libra Advisory Group. Let me pick up on several points that have been made and also build on Sarah's comment and address the dissonance at a grand strategic level between what we've heard. On the one hand, I think what you've laid out very clearly, Don and Rory, is that we do know a lot better how to do this expansive state-building stabilisation agenda, but we also realise how difficult it is in terms of resources, time, and public and political commitment, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's Liberia. So we've learned how to do it, and most of the OECD governments have got a little bit better at getting their act together in terms of how we do this, but we know how difficult it is. At the same time, the point you've made, that even before the financial crisis, the international system was tapped out in terms of military, police, civilian capabilities to actually deliver this effect. Financial crisis is going to hit that even more. So at a time at which we know how to do this better within the OECD countries, we're in a decade where the resources to do this are going to be going down under strain. One solution to this, obviously, is to increase the supply. So we're trying to get the Brazilians and others to come on board the agenda. But as Julian laid out, a lot of the big players here, whether it's the Japanese or the Chinese, aren't going to really play ball in the same way. So the question I have is, in the next decade, apart from optimising what we do within the international institutions and within the OECD countries to improve a little bit how we deliver on this agenda, what sort of choices might we have to make? Might we have to actually realise that some parts of this state-building stabilisation agenda can't be carried out? How do we think about prioritisation and geographically, or indeed, going back to, as someone mentioned earlier, Roland Paris's model, just focusing on the bare essentials of stabilisation and state building? Thank you.
That's a good point. So the issue of choices, having to prioritise at this time, going back to your opening comments, Don, about the lack of resources in particular. So let's bring this gentleman in here. I'm going to go to the lady over there.
Can I just ask, can we have a yes or no answer? I mean, these are really tough questions. Just yes or no or multiple choice.
You remember, they're not questions. They're comments that you can come off. Don't worry, they're not expecting direct answers. Yeah.
I'm Samer Hawari, also from the Humanitarian Policy Group here at ODI. My question is, Don outlined, quite comprehensive 6 steps for kind of rebuilding these contexts, and a lot of them are quite ambitious in scope. But then Julian also mentioned the need for quick wins, and I think he gave the time frame of 18 months for Afghanistan. So I'm just wondering, to what extent can these kind of short-term imperatives be kind of managed with these kind of large, ambitious agendas needed to stabilize these contexts?
The lady over there.
Hi, my name is Sarah Bailey, and I'm also from the Humanitarian Policy Group. Sorry for getting repetitive on this. But my question does deal with the title is Security, Development, and Stabilization, and I'm just wondering, the word humanitarian assistance, where do you see that as fitting in, particularly given Don's comment of, billions for humanitarian assistance and pennies for reconstruction. From a humanitarian standpoint, we're very quick to point out the issue of principles and how the actions of other actors might impact our ability to access humanitarian populations. But what I'm more interested in is really from your standpoint, where do you see it as the, kind of the opportunities and the obstacles for more traditional humanitarian assistance, fitting into this, particularly given the need to deliver, peace dividends or whatever you'd like to phrase that? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've got a first set of comments in here, and some of them are questions, but they've certainly left a lot of flexibility. Don, do you want to take a first crack at... You don't have to definitely answer all of these. I think pick the ones that suit you best. The lessons issue, what are the comparative parts? Have we picked up any best practices? Might be a particularly important one. And that question about elections and are we being deeply negligent, a pretty challenging point.
One of the parts that I didn't get to was the question of sequencing in the 6 sort of steps that I was talking about. And a lot of the questions or comments can be addressed from that concept. One of the problems in Somalia was that we tried to do too much on a broad set of agendas. We tried to create a government, and the government doesn't stand. We tried to create political stability. We tried to fight terrorism. We tried to address our phobia about Islamism, and we cannot have an Islamic state there, all at the same time. And indeed, in a number of these situations, I do believe that a sequencing approach is necessary. I was Bill Clinton's advisor for Africa at the time of the Black Hawk Down incident, and it was very clear to us that having Americans dragged through the streets of Mogadishu meant that the United States would have to pull out its humanitarian efforts, its peace-building efforts, its government construction efforts. For what it's worth, Bill Clinton kept those forces there for 6 months, but the firestorm within the United States to get those forces out was tremendous. And therefore, in that sequence, you really did need military security sense first, and that's the problem that we faced so long in Somalia. I think indeed the sequencing aspect also addresses the question of 18 months in Afghanistan. No, you cannot build a legitimate government. You cannot fight drug trafficking. You cannot create an entire justice and reconciliation mechanism. You certainly can't reconcile permanently the differing interests of Iran and Pakistan and the Central Asian states and the United States and the UK and everyone else. However, you can show enough wins on a variety of these. And I think in that context, the economics is so important. The notion of creating jobs, creating water and power and schools for kids to go back. When we were about to go into Afghanistan, Colin Powell asked the policy planning staff at the State Department, where I was the deputy, to go back and look at 20 similar situations in the past and say, how do you conduct a military campaign in a way that is going to contribute to the post-conflict reconstruction effort? And it was no surprise what we came up with. You don't empower warlords because they're going to be the worst enemies of a unitary state. You go in and you get the water supply and the electricity and the schools and the hospitals up and running before you try to do anything else. You go in with as massive troops as you possibly can in advance, because then you can draw down. It's the old Powell doctrine. You don't do a shock and awe. You don't necessarily abandon the existing military structure. You decapitate it and allow the rest of the structure, who are usually just foot soldiers, to continue, et cetera, et cetera. The bottom line is we did it all wrong. We came out with those proposals. We sent them over to the Pentagon, and they said, well, thank you very much, and we know how to do wars. And you had CIA agents, with turbans around their head riding on horses with warlords taking over Kabul. You had empowerment of drug traffickers. You had empowerment of warlords all around the country. No focus on electricity and water and schools, etc. And so, to a certain extent, we're a pretty disingenuous international community because we say we understand the need for all of these different human security sides, but then we hand it over to the military, and the military does it the way they know how to do it. The one thing, though, that I also wanted to focus on was not reducing this agenda to Afghanistan and Iraq. This is a worldwide agenda that we're dealing with, and we don't even need to say reduce it to Africa. We've got situations in Colombia, Nepal, Sri Lanka, certainly the Balkans, Central Asia. These issues are hot in all of these different contexts. And for me, one of the key elements that we need to be focusing on is what are the measures of success? How do we know we're doing it right? How do we have metrics there that say, this society is in fact getting more stable, and it may allow the international community to step back. And we're not very good at that. Fortunately, the United Nations and its peacekeeping operations are starting to define an end state which would allow the withdrawal of forces. Now, unfortunately, for example, in Cote d'Ivoire, they have 111 indicators that they've got to look at, and those are going to tell them whether they should leave or not. That's worthless. In Liberia, you have 47 indicators. By the way, not a single indicator refers to women in any way, shape, or form. Haiti, same sort of process. I think that's a really positive development, but we've got to get better about defining what are those elements. Otherwise, we're going to end up with more East Timors, where we say, oh, it's stable, we can leave. And then a year later, the fundamental contradictions, especially in that case in the military, reemerge and the society falls apart again. Martin used to be the head of the United Nations Mine Action Service, and I'm afraid he sort of planted a landmine for all of us. I'm not going to step on. But I will say we just got to get smarter about elections. I do believe elections are important. They provide certain aspects. They are a community-wide effort. They draw societies together even as they're divisive. They can provide legitimacy for good individuals. Again, the Ellen Johnson Sirleaf point. They do indicate to the international community that there's progress occurring. But every point that you raised is absolutely valid. And you, as I said, you can provide legitimacy to players who shouldn't be legitimized. I mean, I just keep thinking about the relationship that Bill Swing, as the SRSG in Congo, had with Kabila, where he would walk in and say, Mr. President, I know you're president, but you really have to reform your security sector. You really have to fight down on corruption there, et cetera, et cetera. And he would buy into it. Then we hold actually a pretty good free and fair election, and Alan Doss walks in afterwards and says, Mr. President, you've got to reform your security sector. And he says, screw you, I'm president. I guess I shouldn't say screw.
You probably didn't say that.
I'll bet you he did say that. But he says, I'm president, I'm legitimate, you can't tell me to do that. And right now, this Camilla 2 campaign against the FDLR should never be taking place. The UN knows it, but the UN is actually participating in it because they cannot say to Mr. Kabila, you don't have the right to take this exercise along. So that's not really an answer, but it's about the best I can come up with.
Thank you. Return. Do you want to pick up any of these points? I'm not going to.
Yeah, very quickly. A quick anecdote. I went on a first contact mission with the U.S. Rangers deep in the Pashtun heartland, and we met this. One of the elders said to me about elections. He said, "Well, it's nothing much to do with us, but it seems to make the foreigners happy." And there's a certain truth in that it legitimises our presence for our own people, and I do wonder whether we place elections in the right sequence, as it were, in the process of stabilisation. I have to say, the issues that came up for me were very much that there was a concept problem. We tend to believe that you reconstruct after conflict, but in fact you reconstruct in conflict, because the process of reconstruction is actually part of the security phase, and that our own concept of security and then reconstruction is wrong. Now, one of the problems that we've noticed certainly in Afghanistan is one, and I have to draw on Afghanistan because it's there. I mean, if we don't get this vaguely right, we ain't going to do much more of it. I can tell you that. There's no political appetite for it. One, it's all very well talking about stabilisation and reconstruction, but there's a vector gap. We need more robust civilians. There's a point in which you have to hand over from the military leadership to a civilian leadership. But we've got the wrong military to do it. We were all encouraged in the 1990s to go for ever lighter, ever leaner, ever more networked, ever more deployable forces, which meant the cost per boot went up exponentially, which means most militaries just don't have many boots. And yet the space they have to cover and time they have to cover is enormous. Therefore they can clear, but they can't hold. So you never actually reach a point on the task cycle, the security continuum, when you actually hand over to civilians. We kind of need a new tranche of civilians who are actually probably ex-military or something, robust, who've worked with people like yourselves to fill that vector. Another issue I'd just like to mention, and I see this in various meetings in Kabul and Kandahar and places, to what extent there is a problem between getting our political right and our political left to agree on operations. Often I have to say, when I sit in a room of military commanders and humanitarian experts, there's a clear political agenda. And they do tend to be our political right and our political left. And there's a kind of hidden disconnect because of it, because much of the effort is to try and find common ground between two very different ways of doing security. And we ignore that, but it's implicit all the time. One final thought. If you look at Western forces make up 4% of UN peacekeeping operations. 4%. And the trouble is, not many of those other forces are very good at this stuff. Because we've learned lessons, because we actually have a lessons learned mechanism, both civil and military. Many of the other militaries I've spoken to from Africa and elsewhere have no lessons learned mechanism. They do what they do. They go in and they do it the way they've always done it. Some of them are, shall we say, somewhat demanding of the local environment to justify their presence. But there's not that learning process in many militaries which makes the UN process an iterative one. And I think that's where we have to do far more work as it were, the West within the UN framework to enhance UN effect in this area.
Thank you. Rory, any comments you want to pick up?
Yeah, just firstly on Sarah's point about maybe looking at coherence rather than that being the focus, rather than necessarily the comprehensive approach. I think that makes a lot of sense. The OECD, the United Nations, NATO and the World Bank, together with a whole host of donors, came together last year and we signed off on what's called a 3C roadmap, the 3C meaning coherence, coordination and complementarity, where we said that we're going to try and be more coherent. That's rhetoric, and we need to make it into reality, but it's certainly a first step. But I think in making it into reality, financing mechanisms, I know it's boring, but it's important, is a key aspect in ensuring that we have a coherent approach. And to skip to the other question from the ODI colleague about, where does the humanitarianism fit in all of this? And I think it fits in insofar as up until now we've had a humanitarian paradigm over here, and we've had a development school over here, and budget lines have tended to go to both. and we need to cross-fertilize those. And there's a big agenda right now taking place within the international community about creating more early recovery financing mechanisms which can help bridge this gap. So that's one practical solution. Another, I'll try and be practical to the Somalia question. I mean, the international community is clearly struggling with this for a long time, but there are some practical steps that need to be taken. Number one, the money flow needs to be cut off. I mean, clearly, Shabab are buying AK-47. AK-47 are being smuggled into Somalia. That the money flow has to be cut off. That's certainly, one of the first things. And the amount of small arms and light weapons in Somalia today needs to be curtailed and destroyed. These are priorities. And there's also obviously a peace dividend priority that needs to run in parallel. But these are certainly things that probably need to be looked at in more detail. The final point from me, I guess, linking the question on elections to the question on sequencing and where we need to prioritize, I guess we need to think a lot about how we're going to improve state-society relations by enhanced legitimacy. And that means that we're going to need to think more carefully about sequencing, which is going to have to be context-based. We know now, I mean, Lord Ashdown has said that the sequence in Bosnia was wrong. It should have been rule of law first, elections second, rather than the other way around. But that may not be the case in every country. So we're going to have to be context-specific on one hand and very sequenced on the other. So there's no real easy answer. Thanks.
We've got literally about 5 minutes left, so let me bring in maybe two more comments and give everyone a chance to go one more run around. So there's a gentleman waiting right here, somebody else in the middle. Yeah, I've got you, sir.
Thank you. Yes, Michael Bailey from Oxfam. Thanks to the panelists. Great presentations. One comment and then a sort of comment and a question at the end. I mean, I think the talk about the holistic approach and alignment is obviously important, but it only really helps if you're aligned around the right goals and the right strategies. I mean, if you have the wrong goals and strategies, then it's probably even worse. So the question then becomes, well, how do you get the right strategies? And I've been struck how critical it is when we're embarked on this complex endeavour of dealing with the fragile states, the state building, the stabilisation, how labour intensive it is. You have to put a lot of people onto it, but also how much you have to know about the national reality. And clearly, if you look at the catalogue of errors in Afghanistan over the years, which I think are now increasingly recognised, much of it was because we were coming at it with a dogmatic approach and ignorance. So, the need to really understand the culture and the politics and the history of the countries that we're engaged with is I think, can't be, underestimated. And in that sense, I don't think the UK is free of this problem. If you look at the turnover of military, the lack of resourcing in DFID to address the challenges they have in Afghanistan, say. Sometimes we meet people in the Foreign Office who are dealing with big questions but actually don't really know the country very well. I talked to someone in the Cabinet Office who had responsibility, had never been to Afghanistan. So, there's a real challenge there of building up the knowledge to do this properly. My comment is and question is around the area of peacekeeping, though. I mean, we've seen the work that we've done in Oxfam around Chad and Darfur and Eastern Congo, the importance of the security sector reform, which is often neglected. So I'd like to stress that, but also the important role of police. The failure of policing in Eastern Chad. If you look at the failure of building the Afghan National Police Force, if you look at the failure on the police side in DRC, this is a critical area. And I think, the DRC case, I think, illustrates very much the importance of investment in security sector reform, which is neglected. I mean, we interviewed, I think his name was General Michel, who was head of the European Security Sector Force, and he said that they couldn't get the money. They couldn't get the money to get the computers running, which would have sorted out the payroll for the Congolese armed forces. Well, if you sorted out the payroll and removed some of the ghosts on the payroll and actually got money to the soldiers, you might have reduced the predatory activities, of the Congolese armed forces, which would have enormously enhanced the security of civilians in that part. So, just to underline the point, my question is actually, given that we have got the 100,000 peacekeepers, though, practically, what were the sort of 2 or 3 things you would do to have them working more effectively? They're there. It's a big resource. Can we provide better equipment, better training, improve their mandates, so that they're really genuinely delivering on protection of civilians? So I'll finish with that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to get, I think it's the last question coming in here, or last comment question, and then a last very quick run through so we can finish by 2:30.
Just a quick question for Donald. I mean, now just following through the 6 steps, which is he mentioned earlier about how to stabilize in a protected conflict. And I was following the last point, which is the regional context. And then I just thinking about what happened in 2006, the end of 2006, when the Ethiopian army invaded Somalia, and through the tactical support by the United States, and which created the emergence of more radical Al-Shabaab group. And do you think it's a mistake to, international community to support, or the West, that invasion, and also what lesson has been learned since that, mistake has been made by the regional superpowers? Thank you.
Well, as I know, we will try and close at 2:30. Let me do a last run through, and let's just take it in the same order as last time to give folks a chance to think. Don.
Thank you. Finally, a yes or no answer. Yes, it was a mistake for the international community to support the Ethiopians to go in. We never realized, as an international community, the nationalism in Somalia that would respond to that negatively. We gave them an undoable mission. They are too involved in the issue to be considered to be neutral, and their rapid departure was probably the best possibility, along with the departure of the previous president, that actually gave us some hope at the end of last year that the situation might improve. So absolutely the answer is yes, and I think that's part of the lessons learned is my answer. On the question of what we can do in peacekeeping, my single answer is civilian protection. I think that is the one area where peacekeepers can, as an international community, provide a service that we're not really very good at right now. We're trying to learn those dynamics, but if you look at Eastern Congo, or you look at any of the other places where there is actually conflict going on, empowering the peacekeeping missions to go in and protect human beings, whether it's women who are being raped, whether it's the individuals who are being hurt when the LRA rampages through an area, the FLDR, etc. That's the one area I think they need Chapter 7 capability to go in and actually stop things before they start, to use lethal force if necessary, and they need training because, in fact, they're sent out there without clear training in civilian protection.
Thanks for the very specific answer.
Right, yeah, very quickly. One, avoid box ticking back in capitals. Make projects relevant to the people on the ground. That is part of the national knowledge. Two, there's an awful lot of practical things we can do with both the AMPS and the ANA right now. Canadian Sergeant Major told me in Kandahar, Kabul Military Training Centre, the Americans are doing the officer training, the French, so the NCO training, the French are doing the officer training. By the time they get them to Kandahar, they have to break it all down and start all over again. So there are things that we could do to improve our current performance. And three, UN peacekeeping. One, have a UN programme of defence education for all officers engaged on this business. Two, create a single command and control mechanism across coalitions under UN mandate. Three, have a single UN civil planning concept, again under UN mandate, and therefore enhance and reform DPKO.
For everyone here, DPKO?
Department of Peacekeeping Operations.
Thank you. Those are very specific and puts the UN right at the heart, but very interesting. Thank you. Roy.
Yeah, very quickly also. What we would say in the OECD is that we need to work towards national security compacts that are jointly put together, led by the government, with local ownership and supported by donors. Peacekeepers need to have a vision of why they're there and what they're doing, and national security compacts seem vital. These national security compacts need to be directly linked to financing, and they need to be directly linked to benchmarks. Otherwise, they are in fact of little use. But peacekeepers are not just carrying out benign tasks, and they are political actors, whether they like it or not, and they need to be linked up to a political vision.
Well, thank you very much for a great panel. I'm not going to try to praise the wide range of topics that have come out so far. I would say that just judging by the 3 sets of comments we had today, it's not as if we're short on ideas and lessons learned. I think we had 3 very clear and actually quite distinct sets of presentations, each of which in a way covered a different part of the spectrum of the challenges trying to confront fragile states. I thought they were very clear, very specific. The problem obviously we face is sequencing, and I think, Don, you really came to this. In a way, you can't give a single answer on sequencing. We'd have to take it country by country, region by region, potentially within countries on the sequencing issue. But as I said, the basic theories, processes, practices, priorities are there. I'm very glad, Julian, you brought in those comments about the UN and the potential coordinating role it could do in terms of best practices. I think that was an important point. We're delighted to hear the OECD. Rory's got you there with such experience. Thank you very much for coming and for providing great dialogue. And as you know, Sarah will let you know when the next part of this series will take place. But please give a hand to our 3 panelists. Thank you.